Now, let me say first that if you joined us in person or online at the 10:30 a.m. service this morning, the readings in the sermon were completely different from what I'm going to be talking about now. This morning, we celebrated the funeral of Alice Tyner, a matriarch of St. Mark's and All Saints, a woman whose life was devoted to God despite suffering great hardships, and a person who was known for calling out priests who rambled on too long in their sermons. And so, talk of hanging a man on the gallows he constructed to execute someone else, or of cutting off one's own hand or cutting out one's own eye to prevent sin did not seem appropriate. And trying to explain why we have these things in the Bible and what they mean would have taken much too long and veered far away from remembering the life of Alice. So I selected some alternative readings instead, and I kept my sermon very short. That said, we need to be careful to read the Bible in its entirety, to understand what is actually in there, and not just the parts that are easy to like. So I want to take the time to talk about the book of Esther and Mark 9:38 to 50. Now, with Esther, it is important to understand first and foremost, none of this actually happened. This is not a story of literal factual events. It is a story, much like those told by the Brothers Grimm or the many fairy and folk tales from cultures throughout the world. It was never meant to be taken as a literal recounting of actual events. It was always meant to be understood as a story. That said, it is in the Bible. So while it was never meant to be taken literally, it was meant to be taken seriously. And it does tell us something about God and God's relationship to the people of Israel, and indirectly about God's relationship to us, though God goes unmentioned throughout the entire book. To understand what is going on in chapters 7 and 9 of Esther, it is helpful to understand the context of the entire story. The book of Esther was likely written during a period in the 3rd or 4th centuries before the Common Era, when the land of Israel was under Greek control. But it tells the story of a time a century or two before, during the height of the Persian Empire's power. The king in the story is the king of Persia, the most powerful person in the Mediterranean world that time. The queen at the beginning of the story is not Esther, but Vashti, but she directly disobeys the king. And so the king chooses another queen from amongst the young women living in the land. And the woman he chooses is Esther. Now, Esther was an orphan who was living with her older cousin Mordecai, who raised her and was a descendant of a Jewish family that had been carried off into exile by the Babylonians, but who had chosen to stay in the diaspora after the Persian king Cyrus freed the Jewish people to return to Israel and Judah. And after Esther becomes queen, she keeps Mordecai close at hand as her advisor and guardian. But Mordecai upsets Haman, the king's chief advisor, because he will not worship Haman or the Persian gods. So Haman decides to take out his anger with Mordecai on all of the Jews living within the Persian Empire, and orders what in later centuries in the Russian Empire would be described as a pogrom, a massacre and seizure of property of all the Jewish people that would begin in a year's time. Now, again, no such pogrom is known in ancient Persia, but such things did happen in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds and would continue throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the 19th century, even into Nazi Germany. And so while this particular event did not actually happen, the threat of such an event is something the Jewish people have been living with for millennia. As a result of this order, Mordecai is absolutely crushed. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, and pours ashes on his head. But Esther, she is portrayed as being unaware, uninterested, absolutely oblivious to the impending doom of her people. But when Esther is confronted by Mordecai, she takes on the cause of her people. Meanwhile, Haman becomes even more enraged with Mordecai and decides to have Mordecai hung from a giant set of gallows immediately, rather than wait for the end of the year when the pogrom would begin. But then Esther has a great feast, and in a scene that is very similar to the death of John the Baptist, the king offers her anything, up to half of his kingdom, and she pleads the cause of her people, that they be saved from their impending death. And as we hear in the first reading, the king is so enraged at hearing Haman has plotted the death of his beloved Esther's people that he has Haman hung from the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. And in memory of this day of salvation from certain death, the Feast of Purim, a day of special feasting, the reading of the story from the book of Esther, with noisemakers being used to blot out Haman's name, the giving of charity to the poor, and masquerading. In this story, God's salvation through human action and the duty to care for one's neighbor when one experiences prosperity is seen. It is also a story of redemption. Esther basically goes from being seen as a brainless, pretty little thing to the wisest and most cunning character in the story. And through the transformation of Esther is hope for all of us, that no matter who we are or who we have become, there's always hope for us that we still have a role in God's plan. We are all imperfect, but through God, we can all do good. Now, the gospel reading similarly was changed this morning because the reading speaks of cutting off one's hand or cutting out one's own eye to keep from sinning. And I've heard this described as hyperbole on Jesus's part. That Jesus was not actually encouraging people to cut off a hand or tie a millstone around their own neck or cut out their own eye to keep from sinning. And I agree, this was not something that Jesus was actually encouraging. But I do not think what he was doing was hyperbole. I think he was challenging people, particularly those with privilege, to stop blaming others for their own sins, to take personal responsibility for their actions. Now let me take a step back. There are 3 sections in today's gospel, and while sometimes there is a direct connection between passages, there seems to instead be 3 sections of sayings of Jesus that were just strung together within the narrative. And so the idea of someone who is not against us is for us, cutting one's hand off to stop from sinning, and salt losing its flavor are not meant to be understood as thematically the same thing. But back to the cutting off of hands and feet, cutting out eyes, and tying millstones around one's own neck. What Jesus was talking about is a defense in which those who have power, those with privilege, in our society, cis, heterosexual, white, wealthy males, and to a lesser degree, those with different combinations of those traits, use when they victimize the most vulnerable. He whistled at me. Her skirt was too short, her dress was too tight, her scarf was not covering her whole face. He talked back to me. She should have covered her drink. She should not have been drinking to begin with. She should have been carrying a whistle, pepper spray, a gun. She should never have been walking by herself. She was asking for it. He was asking for it. They were asking for it. And finally, well, we cannot send him to jail. We cannot send her to prison. It will destroy his future. It will destroy her reputation. Boys like him, men like him, girls like her, women like her don't go to prison. And Jesus's answer is true justice is equitable justice for all, whether in this world or in the next. So before we go and try to blame someone else, we need to first examine our own choices. Nobody else can make us sin. If we sin, it is our own choice. We need to prevent our own sinning, not regulate how others live their lives to make ourselves more comfortable. And if that means dismembering oneself, then so be it. The wrath of God for those who hurt the innocent, the vulnerable, the oppressed will be fearsome and far worse than anything we could ever do to ourselves. But the point is not dismemberment. Neither Jesus nor I are recommending self-harm. Rather, the point is you, me, we need to learn self-control. And the thought of self-harm should stand as a barrier to harming others. God is with us through it all, but it is our choice. We can choose to sin, or we can choose to be like Esther and become instruments of God's plan. Amen.